8 months ago, from its stronghold in Gaza, Hamas launched a brutal and sophisticated attack, systematically targeting civilian population centers in Israel's western Negev. The October 7, 2023 assault, in which Hamas butchered 1,200 people and took another 250 hostage, ignited a war between Israel and Hamas that has utterly devastated the Gaza Strip, displaced the vast majority of Gazans, and caused a tremendous amount of civilian harm. Since October, Iran's proxies and partners in the Middle East region have steadily and incrementally escalated the level of violence directed at Israel, U.S. military targets, and commercial shipping in the maritime domain, creating destabilizing effects felt regionally and globally. This, of course, includes the unprecedented missile and UAV attack Iran launched against Israel in April. Casualties continue to mount as the Israeli military is forced to clear and re-clear territory, absent a strategic vision from the Israeli government of a day-after plan. Similarly, civilian casualties in Gaza also continue to grow, with news reportedly of another significant civilian casualty event last night in Gaza when the IDF attempted to target a Hamas cell operating in an UNRWA school. Meanwhile, the low-intensity conflict on Israel's northern border between the IDF and Hezbollah continues to expand in scope and lethality, preventing 60,000 Israelis from returning to their homes and making the prospects of another war in Lebanon soberingly real. At this moment, there's a deal on the table that would bring hostages home, pause the fighting, and potentially create a window to end the war, relaunch a process to achieve a durable peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and continue Israel's normalization and integration into the region. Joining us to discuss the ongoing conflict, U.S. policy, and what may come next, I'm pleased to welcome our esteemed guest. He is the Executive Director of the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute and the Executive Director of the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, also known as Cyber Florida. He is currently the President of the Board of Directors of the Institute of Applied Engineering at the University of South Florida, a Distinguished Senior Fellow on National Security at the Middle East Institute, a member of the International Advisory Committee of the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations, and a member of the National Security Advisory Council U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. He has authored a new book, The Melting Point, High Command in War in the 21st Century, which will be the subject of an upcoming CNAS event. And finally, he is also the former commander of United States Central Command, retiring from that post in March 2022, capping off a 42-year career in the U.S. Marine Corps. It is my honor to welcome to CNAS General Frank McKenzie.
Thanks, Sean.
In a few minutes, I'm going to turn to our in-person and virtual audience for your questions. If you're joining us virtually, please share your question on cnas.org/live or X using the hashtag CNAS2024. General McKenzie, we'll just jump right in. There's a tremendous amount of devastation, a vast amount of insecurity, a desperate, traumatized population, and a growing and sophisticated insurgency. I could be describing Iraq in 2006 or Gaza today. What is your assessment of the situation in Gaza right now, and what military advice would you give to President Biden?
Sure. So I think Israel has largely been able to have military success against the fighting units of Hamas. The 24 battalions, however you choose to characterize them, they're probably largely no longer effective. But that's actually misleading, because the way Hamas fights and the way they've designed their defense, I take a parallel in my service, the United States Marine Corps. If we lose 1 in 5 of our people in an organization, we consider that organization ineffective, would pull them out, would have to replace them. The way that Hamas has chosen to fight in Gaza, typically by isolated elements in buildings, in positions that they don't need to maneuver, they're going to fight to the death there, you can absorb a much higher level of casualties and still retain the ability to punish the IDF as they try to clear it. So the fact that Israel has had significant success at treating the foot soldiers, if you will, is a little bit misleading, because there's still, I think, a fairly effective residual of combat power. Maybe not enough to replicate what happened on 7 October, but still there's significant combat power left inside Gaza. Where Israel has not had significant success, in my judgment anyway, is in getting at the political echelon and getting at the military leadership echelon of Hamas, because they have very cleverly hidden themselves. They're in deep bunkers. They're probably surrounded by whatever surviving Israeli hostages there are. And at the same time, as we see from the series of events that you referred to, Hamas has brilliantly designed their defense. So any Israeli commander, when he's confronted with a Hamas target, has to make a choice. Are you going to attack this target and accept the inevitable civilian collateral damage that's associated with it because they're firmly embedded in that civilian population? Believe me, Hamas is not interested in civilians leaving Rafah or anywhere else. They need the civilians to stay in place so that if Israel comes after Hamas combat forces, they have to attack civilians. And of course, that in and of itself is a war crime, to embed your military capabilities inside a civilian force that can't maneuver. So I think the Israelis have actually tried very hard to achieve proportionality. Sometimes they've succeeded, sometimes they have failed. Nonetheless, if they're going to continue the campaign, we're going to see continued loss of innocent civilian life as they address the residual elements of what's left of Hamas. And there's a fair amount left of Hamas, including, as I've already noted, the very tip top of both the civilian and the political echelon. So as I look at it, what you need to consider what's next. And if I have a criticism of the Israeli design, is it's just not clear to me how it actually ends. And the United States has been guilty of this before, so we actually should be careful throwing stones when you live in a glass house, because we've conducted campaigns without a clear understanding of what the end state is. Any kind of military planning, planners are taught, and I grew up as a military planner, you want to start with the end state. What does it look like at the end? Then you walk forward in time to stand at that end state. You describe it. What does it look like? What are the performance measures we can apply to characterize it in a quantitative and in a qualitative way? And then you look back and you find the path that leads you from where you are now, in the case of the Israelis, 8 October, to where you want to be at the end. And I think, we need to do some work on what that end state's going to be. So for me at least, and I'm unapologetic about this, I think the future end state has to be some form of a two-state solution. I've been clear on this really from the beginning. I believe you need to look at what that occupation force is going to be, and you need to look at how you're going to define victory against Hamas. Israel's problem right now is, again, the senior leadership is still very active. If the senior leadership were gone, they would have considerably more flexibility in how they talk about ending the current campaign. But because they've not been able to do that, I think they're forced into continuing this grinding assault. And those who talk about, well, we could do this with special operations raids, we could be far more targeted, the further you are away from the battlefield, the more attractive that becomes. I have some experience in this. When I think of highly sophisticated special operations forces operating in an urban environment on raids, I am drawn to what happened in Mogadishu in 1993, where we put the best special operations force in the world into a significantly disrupted, dangerous urban environment, and we took significant casualties as a result of that. So people who talk about, well, we can do pinprick strikes, no, you can't. It's combat in the built-up area. It's hard to get in there. It's combat in 3 dimensions. You're under the earth. You're on the surface of the earth. You're in the immediate top of the earth because both sides are flying drones. Israeli drones are better, more capable, but I'm sure Hamas is flying them as well. So it truly is a vicious, brutal environment that is very difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. And the idea that we can bring Supermen in to do a little raid in there and get the target, it's just not going to happen. The Israeli intelligence, while good, is not that good. And Hamas targets are going to be surrounded by, again, the hostages that are surviving, however many that may be, and the larger hostage shield that's there, which is the actual population of Gaza. So having said all that, look, the future ought to be some form of an occupation force. I would prefer that it not be Israeli. I think the Israeli military probably prefers that it not be Israeli. It should be Arab in character. It could be from neighbors in the region. It could be from other states that have expressed interest in going in there. It doesn't have to be in the structure of the Oslo Accords. I don't think Hamas has a place at the table. Easy for me to say that. The devil's in the details, because they're going to want to claim a place at the table if there's some kind of a negotiated agreement going forward. So Israel's in a very difficult spot. Here's the one thing I would just tell you. All the criticism has been of Israel, because we see the tortured internal deliberations that occur inside, but still a democratic government in a democratic state. You see none of what Hamas is doing, because they're a terrorist organization. They present a monolithic front, and I would argue their demands are maximalist that have not actually changed from day one. So while Israel's demands have changed, and we watch those goals change in real time as the campaign has gone on. Hamas has been able to occlude that, and it's not visible because they're not an open organization, and we don't know what's going on inside their internal deliberations. There's still, I think, some hard days of this campaign ahead of us. Hamas is going to try to make it as hard as they can for the Israelis as they try to come to some form of a conclusion and some form of a day after that, again, in my opinion, needs to find some way to give a reasonable quality of life for those Palestinians in Gaza in some form of ultimate sovereignty. A lot of people disagree with that. My friends in Israel certainly do, and I am aware of all the challenges that present themselves. But the alternative is eternal fighting, which I don't think any of us want. Ultimately, nobody wants that except possibly Hamas. I think would welcome that. But I don't think any other entity, and particularly the Arab neighbors, they don't welcome that either. So I think I wish I had better answers. I don't. It's a tough dilemma that the Israelis face right now.
Oh, I guess we could just leave it there then. Unfortunately, it does sound like it might get worse before it gets better. We've seen from this administration, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan recently, last month now, restated the Biden administration's policy from the White House podium before embarking on a trip to Saudi Arabia and Israel. In his 10 points, he reasserted the administration's belief that defeating Hamas requires more than a lethal combat operation, as you describe, but rather needs a concerted effort to outsecure and outgovern Hamas in Gaza. But of course, as you also state, Hamas won't sit idly by. It's an active insurgency. It's quite organized. The command and control is still there. The tunnel system is still there. The military capacity is still very much there, as we've seen. So while Israel may still have to continue to do the combat operations as well as the capitation strikes on leadership that we ourselves would do in a counterinsurgency campaign, what does an attendant parallel population-centric mission to defeat Hamas in Gaza look like in your estimation as a planner? How many forces would it require and what types of capabilities?
Yeah, it's going to require significant on-the-ground forces, many thousands of forces. It's going to require not only combat forces, it's going to require stability elements, it's going to require policing forces. You're going to have to find a way to feed people, you're going to have to find a way to give medical care to people. It's going to require billions of dollars of investment. I believe all those elements are there. And I don't believe all those elements require the United States to put the money into the game. I believe there are nations that have the ability to do this, and I believe that there are also nations that have the ability to provide these forces. Now, some technical assistance from the United States might be necessary, but I don't think that we would I don't think we would help by putting U.S. forces on the ground, and I would not recommend that. Not my decision to make, not my advice to give. But I think that there are alternatives that don't involve the long-term Israeli occupation, that do involve trying to get after the root causes of Palestinian discontent. But ultimately, you've got to find, I think, a way to see some form of a sovereign solution for them if you ever want to try to find a way out of this problem.
Sure. You know, in that, I do think there is both the political challenge that you alluded to, that there is very little appetite right now in Israeli public sentiment to talk about a two-state solution in the wake of the trauma of October 7th. But of course, there's a military and a practical element here as well. We all recognize that to effectively defeat an insurgency of the type that Hamas brings to bear, you need combat operations, but as you reference, a very significant occupation force to provide stability, security, services, humanitarian aid, rebuild civil society. If it's not the Israelis, and if it's not the Americans who have some experience in doing this, how practically or effective could an Arab force be, an exogenous, outside Arab force? Do they have, in your estimation, just the simple military capability and competency to do a complicated mission like that? Putting aside, then we can discuss some of the political challenges as well.
So it's a less than perfect solution, but I believe, yes, they do. They might require some U.S. assistance, some Western enablers in order to come in for unique capabilities that they don't inherently possess. But I do believe they possess the size of forces, and I also believe, equally important, the financial backing within the region, should nations choose to make those choices, that would allow it to be a viable concept. Look, it's not going to be perfect, but we're in the land of imperfect solutions. We're in the Middle East. We're in Central Command. There's no good answer to anything.
That's right.
It's the least bad choice all the time.
Always.
That you're stuck with.
Yeah.
I just don't see another way forward that doesn't involve endless fighting. Right. And I don't think anybody wants endless fighting, ultimately, except Hamas.
Right. I agree with you. I think the administration clearly agrees with you. In terms of that military technical capacity, right now, just for scope and scale, to do its Rafah operation in the south, and then to do what has been a perennial operation further north to clear and then re-clear areas of Gaza City or the central camps, there's typically been roughly 10 Israeli brigades, roughly 13 to 15,000 troops in Gaza at any given time, just for those military operations. When we think about a landmass twice the size of the District of Columbia, a population 3 times the size of the District of Columbia, it's going to take a very significant hold force to secure that population. What's in it for these Arab states? I mean, countries that are otherwise traditionally, in your experience, I would say very risk-averse to deploy their own forces. For one, there's just that attendant risk and culture of being reluctant to deploy forces. And then 2, there's the political risk here. Are they going to want to put their forces on the ground to do stabilization, clear, hold, build, while Israel is almost assuredly going to need to continue to fight the insurgency? Because we could probably assess Hamas isn't going to sit idly by and just let this happen and see themselves pushed out of the governance of Gaza.
So let's take a step back. So what's in it for the Arab states? Here's the argument I would say. First of all, observe how relatively mild support has been for the Palestinian cause in Gaza from Arab states. They've been vocal, but nobody's actually done much significantly, militarily or otherwise, to support what's going on in Gaza. I think that, particularly for the Gulf states, the principal threat remains Iran. And to face Iran, and this is a threat that's far more imminent than it was 15 years ago when I began to study the problem in detail for the first time. The Iranian threat is very real, it's very powerful, and it's an integrated air and missile threat. So to face Iran, you really need the capabilities that Israel brings to the fight, and you need the United States capabilities. So anything that would make it possible to further normalize relations with Israel, I think, is an objective of the Arab states. In order to do that, if you can bring some form of balance, management to what's going on in Gaza, that aids that objective. Because it's just my opinion that, the Iranian threat is a greater priority than the Palestinian problem to Arab states. My opinion, others may have different opinions. But at the same time, you realize it's hard to go forward unless you can find some form of, I won't say closure because that's too elegant a word and need a word to describe what it would be, but something that actually shows a good faith effort to give the Palestinians something. I think that contributes to a larger goal of many nations in the region, which is to prepare to defend against inevitable Iranian misbehavior, reckless misbehavior across the region, both by their proxies and also by their considerable conventional military capabilities, air and space military capabilities.
As you would famously say in uniform, just Frank McKenzie's opinion, which obviously is the understatement of the century. But
just my nickel.
I will say, though, that by and large, it appears the region does agree with you. We've seen from a realpolitik approach, Arab states that have normalized with Israel continue to stand by the Abraham Accords, continue to engage. UAE continues to fly from Ben Gurion, has never stopped. I mean, American Airlines, or not the brand, but American carriers have come and gone with the security threats, but Fly Dubai and Emirates never stop flying. Right. The Emiratis go to sleep every night under the protection of not one, but 2 Israeli air defense systems. And so clearly, those countries see the benefit, and it's very clear that Saudi Arabia does as well. And I think if we played the tape back and go back to October 6th, many people were sitting around and trying to figure out the secret sauce, the recipe, how much Israeli-Palestinian peace process you needed to sprinkle into the cake to make the Saudi-Israel normalization dough rise. And I think where we sit now is, from the administration's perspective, we've inverted the model, and they're going to try to bring regional normalization through the eye of this Israeli-Palestinian peace process. But I have to say that the issue of Iran looming large in the region very clearly, I think, is on everyone's mind. We saw in April this massive aerial assault, over 300 ballistic missiles, UAVs coming at Israel, and we saw what was very much an effective regional response. not to, I'll give you a tremendous degree of credit. I remember when I was a staffer at HASC and you were the commander of Central Command, I think it might have been fiscal year 2019, on the unfunded priorities list from CENTCOM, you were asking for a lot more support for air defense systems. And air defense has now become really not just the coin of the realm in the Middle East, but worldwide. How do you see this regional effort moving forward? What are the tools and capabilities that our partners are going to need to face this Iranian threat now and in the coming years?
So in 2010, I was a brand new one-star, then a two-star working at CENTCOM for a guy named Jim Mattis, who was the CENTCOM commander. And he had a vision of integrated air and missile defense across the theater. I went forward many times along with a guy named Dave Goldfein, who was in the AFCENT commander, went on to be Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and just a great guy. Tried to bring the nations together, by the nations I'm talking about the Gulf states, to recognize the threat from Iran. They were uninterested. Other factors drew their attention. Iran, while powerful, didn't seem to be a compelling threat. What has changed is this. Since 2010 to today, the Iranians have built a significant capability in their ballistic missiles. And ballistic missiles, I'm talking about weapons that can range Tel Aviv, so anywhere in the theater effectively. I'm talking about land attack cruise missiles, which are lower flying, generally air breathing, but not necessarily missiles, and then drones. So I would further argue that's the crown jewels of Iran. It's not the nuclear program. I would further argue that Iran actually doesn't intend to possess a nuclear weapon. They intend to be at breakout level to possess a nuclear weapon, because at breakout level, but not crossing that Rubicon, they can cause us to dance. Look at the headlines in the newspapers today. They can cause the Europeans to dance, they can cause us to dance, they can cause political effect abroad, and they can get sanctions relief, and they can get money. Iran could have a nuclear weapon 3 months if they wanted to have a nuclear weapon. It would be a big weapon that might fit on this platform and might not. It has a delivery problem. How do you get it to the target? Let's say it's Tel Aviv. They've still got a year left to do the aeronautical engineering to build a weapon system and weaponize that. So it's a while before they could do that. So Iranians actually, I think, value the missile force in all its forms. That's the most important thing. So that's grown. Nations in the region have seen it. They've seen the Iranian attacks on Saudi Aramco in September 2019. They've seen the attack on us at Al-Assad in January 2020. So they've seen all these attacks, and they know and understand the imminence of the threat. Plus Iranian vocalization of the threat. They've been quite explicit about it. So that has changed, and sometimes we don't recognize that because we're overly fixated on the nuclear component, which is a very real problem. I don't mean to minimize it, but nonetheless, the Iranian conventional ballistic land attack and drone capability has grown. So the nations have seen that. So the other things that happened were, of course, the Abraham Accords. Brought Israel sort of diplomatically, got them a foothold in the region, and that was very important. It opened the door. The operationalization of the Abraham Accords was the entry of Israel into the Central Command region, which occurred in 2021. It's a bureaucratic thing, but it's actually a huge thing. But what it allows you to do as the CENTCOM commander, you now have convening authority to bring together all the chiefs of defense, including the Israeli Chad. So this used to be a secret, but the Wall Street Journal explained it pretty thoroughly to everyone. In August of 2021 and in early spring 2022, I convened meetings at Sharm el-Sheikh, southern end of the Sinai Peninsula, with the Chads of the region, including the Israeli Chad. And at those meetings, we talked in great detail about the Iranian air missile threat, in great detail, to defend against an Iranian attack against Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, Bahrain, and Israel, Jordan, Egypt, all those possibilities. Because here's the thing, air and missile defense is an easy, it's low-hanging fruit in the region, because to conduct collective air and missile defense, you don't have to give up significant sovereignty. Nobody's stationing tanks on your territory. Nobody's stationing troops on your territory. Air and missile defense is about sharing information and data. It's about building a common operational picture so everybody can see what's going on, and you can share early warning and develop what we call TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures to respond to the threat. So in these conferences, hundreds of hours of staff work went into it. We sat down, looked at the brief, looked at the plans, and there's broad agreement about what we would do under different conditions of Iranian attack against the various states in the region. So I can't overemphasize how important that was. Because first of all, the Israelis participated. The Arab states were happy to be part of them. Look, every Arab nation knows Israeli capabilities. Iron Dome, Iron Beam, David Sling, Patriot. Those are remarkable capabilities. And I want some of that. I like that. Particularly if in the back of your mind you begin to have doubts about the utility of the United States as a long-term partner. The next best partner to have in the region for that kind of air and missile defense actually is Israel. So that groundwork was laid. So let's fast forward a little bit. The work continued. My successor, General Eric Kurilla, has continued these meetings. Staff work has continued. So meanwhile, in the period 2021, in the 20s forward to April, Iran and Israel fought a shadow war across the theater. Shadow war of intelligence services, proxies, and the fact of the matter is Iran was badly outfought by Israel, culminating in the 1 April strike on Iranian IRGC planners in Damascus. As a result of that, Iran decision makers decided they needed to respond to sort of reset it. And the option they chose, they took a page from the Russian playbook, escalate to de-escalate. If you don't like the way the game's being played, you do something dramatic and bold, over the top, to make your opponent sit back and say, whoa, do I really want to play at the game with these new stakes? But here's the problem. Escalate to de-escalate is a card the Russians can play because they have nuclear weapons. Iran played the card of using this missile force I've just talked about to generate a massive attack against Israel, and particularly Nevatim airfield, where they rightly or wrongly thought that's where the attack generated. And I should say, I don't believe the Israelis have actually taken responsibility for that attack in Damascus. I don't think it was the Germans. But the Israelis have said it's not. They haven't said one way or another. I think we can draw our own conclusions about that. So, but and Nevatim is where the Israeli F-35s are. So those who say that the Iranian attack was signaled, that's nonsense. It was a maximum effort. And so about 300 weapons, 100 or so ballistic missiles. Why only 100 or so ballistic missiles? Iranian ballistic missiles are stored in missile storage areas. They have to be brought out and put on TELs, tractor erector launchers. The Iranians have, let's say for the sake of argument, 150 of those. That's your max sortie generation. That's all you can fire. Then you got to go back and get more missiles and come back out. So if you fire, say, 100, 120 ballistic missiles, you pair those with drones, and you pair those with land attack cruise missiles, that's a huge effort. This was not a signal. This was not an attempt to be measured in a response. They were attempting to destroy Nevatim airfield with all that would have brought. So what happened was maximum effort from Iran, and the architecture that's out there worked. First of all, the Israelis have great capabilities. I've recited some of the systems that they have. But their neighbors in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia and Jordan, both allowed them to operate over their territory to do intercepts. And the United States, participated in those intercepts. They also intercepted some themselves. So what you got was really a test of two things: a test of the regional defense architecture. I would say it passed with flying colors, and a test of Iranian military capabilities, and it failed. Over half of the Iranian missiles either didn't launch, the ballistic missiles either didn't launch correctly or failed in flight. The Israelis intercepted the vast majority of those that did actually get to theater range and begin to fall into Israel. So what happened as a result of that was, I would argue, Iran gravely weakened as a result of that, because in Iranian eyes, the core capabilities are these missiles, drones, and land attack cruise missiles. The Israelis are strengthened as a result of that. Now, so the test, though, would be what the Israelis did in response. And I was worried they were going to go downtown in Tehran and just do a lot of damage, which they have the capability to do. Instead, their measured response that was, I would argue, tactically brilliant, befuddled the Iranians.
Allegedly response.
Alleged
Alleged
could have been the
Kiwis.
Kiwis.
We don't know.
Could have been. That's right. Could have been. Probably not the Australians. Iranians still aren't sure exactly what happened. So what they did was they said, look, we can fly over your nuclear sites at will. We'll be back tomorrow night if you want to be back tomorrow night. They didn't do a lot of damage. What that did was, first of all, more concern for the Iranians. But second, what it did was it did not push the Arabs away. Key strategic decision. Because had they caused a lot of casualties, Arab nations that had been active in defense of Israel might have worried about keeping that stance. So they preserved both these technological superiority so they demonstrated over Iran, and they also preserved the coalition structure, and that I don't want to be too strong in my language, the coalition structure that gave them the strategic depth and the other forms of support that allowed them to be so effective when the attack was generated. I think that was a very, very important moment in that relationship. Now, the Iranians, they're going to study this, they're going to get better. They're not going to stop. They're not going to stop building weapons. They're going to try to make those weapons better. So this is going to go on. But the Iranian ploy to sort of reset the table failed. They're weaker. And I just close by saying, look, in the Iranian perspective, there are three things that drive Iranian foreign policy. Number one is regime protection. It's a revolutionary regime. The revolutionary generation is leaving the stage. They are historians. They know that revolutions struggle to survive the first level of revolutionaries. So preservation of the regime and exportation of the revolutionary ideology is primary, the theocratic regime, with all that that means. Number one priority. Number two priority, destruction of the state of Israel. Check. Number three priority, ejection of the United States from the region. 2 and 3 never challenge 1. Iran will always come back to objective 1. Because regime survival is paramount. They will never risk regime survival. And they know ultimately with Israel, Israel holds the highest level of the escalation ladder with Iran. Iran knows that. Just as Iran knows we hold the highest level of the escalation ladder with them should we enter it. Iran can manipulate the lower stages, and they can be inventive and violent, but when it comes to the maximum application of violence in the region, they're going to fall short if they choose to fight Israel or if they choose to fight the United States. So Iran will recalculate now. Last thing I would say is any form of deterrence in the region because of the culture, the history, and the immediacy of violence has a short half-life. So I don't know how long it will last, but we're in an interesting phase right now. And again, I would say none of that attack had anything to do, actually, I would argue, with Gaza particularly. It was all about other issues with Israel, not necessarily that. Because if Iran had really wanted to come in, as you know, they would try to push LH into coming in from up north. I'm not sure that Iran could actually force LH to come into the fight. LH will make its own decision, and we can talk about that in the question and answer period. I'll stop talking here in a moment. But LH didn't come in. The only guys that are really 100% into the fight to support Hamas is, of course, the Houthis. And their ability to target Israel is very limited, but what they can do is shut down the Bab el-Mandeb, which they have done and continue to do. And I'll pause there, John.
I have so many questions, but I want to be respectful of our in-person and our virtual audience. So, sir, please, if you will.
Hello, Ken Moriyasu from Nikkei Asia. I'd like to ask about the April 13 Iran attack on Israel and the collaboration between the CENTCOM and Israel in this success in shooting down 99% of the projectiles. What was the degree of training beforehand and sharing information between CENTCOM and Israel? And I'm from Japan, so from that perspective, I think Japan, Australia, South Korea train much more closely with America from day to day. Should we have confidence what are the lessons we draw from the success in the Middle East?
So, first of all, CENTCOM, I would say every nation in the region views Central Command as the honest broker for operations like this. The Combined Air Operations Center, the CAOC, the Air Battle Management Cell, is in Doha, south of Doha at Al Udeid Air Base, and some of it's back in the United States as well. But if you think of it as a hub and spoke, everything processes through there. And that's where nations are confident they can give information. And not everybody wants to share all their information. Look, with Japan, most of our stuff is data link, the highest level of sharing. Same with the Koreans, very, very high level of sharing. Some nations in the region, in the Middle East, we do data link sharing. Some we don't. It's emails, SuperNet emails, or it's telephone conversations. Each one of those is increasingly slow and less responsive to the immediacy of the tactical threat. But still, you're sharing information. So I would argue several things. What lessons should we learn? Our systems work. They work real well. Second, collaboration is an effective way to fight these kinds of fight. You can achieve it. We shared a lot of information with Israel. I don't know the details of it because what I know, I read in the New York Times. But I believe General Kurilla and his team were very active and very aggressive in working with not only Israel, but the other partners in the nation, other nations in the region, as the attack developed. So I think CENTCOM was clearly very important to that, but not only for Israel, but also for our friends in the region who share information. And again, systems work, but so there is a downside to this. I don't know how many AIM-9X missiles we fired, but the AIM-9X, for those of you that aren't into military nomenclature, is an all-aspect heat-seeking missile. It's a fantastic missile. We got a lot fewer of those now than we had in mid-April. And if we're going to fight the Chinese, we're going to need a lot of AIM-9Xs. So it's just something we need to consider. We still remain on the wrong side of the cost imposition curve when it comes to defending against these types of relatively cheap offensive systems with very effective but very expensive defensive systems. It was a great question. Thanks for asking it.
We're going to take one from our virtual audience. This is from John Halpin of the Liberal Patriot. You had mentioned LH, Lebanese Hezbollah, a moment ago. Any thoughts on how Israel should or could handle the Hezbollah threat in the north?
Sure. So my view of Nasrallah and Lebanese Hezbollah is this. They won't enter the fight unless they see the opportunity for strategic victory. Strategic victory would mean destruction of Israel. So in my own mind, I think there's sort of three conditions that I think Nasrallah is thinking about. One would be that Israel is so bogged down in Gaza that they have to denude their defenses up north. That condition's not been met. Condition two would be if they see a political fracture of the Israeli government that would make it difficult for them to fashion a response to an LH attack. All the problems that we see in Israel, that condition is not met. The third condition would be complete international isolation of Israel that would make it hard for other nations to support Israel, including the United States, if LH has attacked. That condition has been partially met, but I would still argue not met. So he knows if he comes in, and LH is the largest non-state military entity in the world, he can generate tens of thousands of missiles against Israel very quickly, and he can cause significant damage. He will stress the elaborate defensive system that we just talked about, because it'll be a multi-axis attack. So you would expect Hamas to launch whatever they've got left into the fight. So Israel will face a true multi-vector attack, which is their most significant concern. However, the other thing is, I believe LH's posture in Lebanon is weaker than it was, say, in 2006, because the economy's in the tank. The government's in the tank because of the confessional nature of the government. You can't seat leadership, can't make decisions. And I would argue, strangely enough, the Beirut port explosion, LH was certainly not responsible for that, but they're viewed as bearing some responsibility for it. And I've overflown that. It looks like a nuclear weapon went off in the port. It destroyed the Beirut economy, and I don't think they've recovered from it yet. So there are profound problems in Lebanon, I think, that put him in a more tenuous position than he has been in the past when he's had to make these decisions. And he's a supreme realist. He will not enter the fight because Iran wants him to enter the fight. He just won't do it. And so I think LH is certainly, they're launching Katyushkas into Israel. There's a low-level back and forth up there. Israel, meanwhile, the prime minister is under great pressure because not 100,000 people, probably 80,000 people have been forced to move south by these attacks. So Israel's going to have to calculate how long they can put up with this before they have to do something. So I would think each side needs to be very careful before they launch an offensive action here. There's a lot of pressure on Israel to do something to clear up the northern tier. There's some pressure on LH, but I think, again, he'll make a cold-eyed, rational, strategic decision about what's best for LH before coming in.
I would love to do this all day, but under great penalty from our communications team, I'm afraid we've got to end it. I think we've almost solved the Middle East today. We'll keep working it together. Busy as ever in military retirement, he is the author of the new book, The Melting Point, High Command in War in the 21st Century, available now, and the future subject of an upcoming CNAS book talk. General Frank McKenzie, thank you so much for your time and insights today. I really appreciate you being here. I remain Jonathan Lord. I'm the Senior Fellow and the Director of the Middle East Security Program here at CNAS. When we come back in a moment, join us for a great discussion on the rise of the multilateral, a new model for geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific. Director of the CNAS Indo-Pacific Security Program, Lisa Curtis, will be joined by Ambassador Shigeo Yamada of Japan, Ambassador Jose Manuel Romualdez of the Philippines, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Camille Dawson, and our very own IPS Senior Fellow, Jake Stokes. Stay tuned. Thank you.